Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, I couldn't quite, I could only hear a little bit of what you're saying, but that's okay. I got the gist of it. Um, so yeah, my presentation is called Metaphorology of Sampling. It's just um, actually like half of my metaphorology of sampling because I realized when I was making it that I wouldn't be able to present everything, but I presenting half of it is fine as well as like a complete work in itself. Um, so I'll just read the paper that I wrote. I think it's easier to do that. Um, and thank you for everyone. Thank you for the great presentations. Thank you for the introduction and everything. So in my ethnographic conversations with hip hop producers and DJs and record collectors, which was afforded by the Clacls Summer Fellowship that I received, right? One metaphor was employed disproportionately to talk about sampling. It's the metaphor of digging, which discloses an archaeological image of the pre-compositional process of sampling, of finding excerpts, musical excerpts to be copied, recovered, and recontextualized. From these commonly used metaphors emerges a whole galaxy of discursive connotations that might help, it's my argument, shed light on the poetics of sampling in general and on Brazilian music sampling in particular. So in this presentation, I'll analyze this metaphor of digging with reference to what it means to hip-hop communities, while aiming at a larger context of significance to which these communities might not be fully attentive. To do so, I'll apply to hip-hop sampling the interpretive method that philosopher Hans Blumenberg systematized as a metaphorology. That is, I will start from commonly used metaphors of a group of interlocutors, analyzing the metaphors they use as if they were indexes of a larger life world. So I'll take, in all seriousness, the imaginative implications conserved in those metaphors, irrespective of them being intentional or not. And this means that I'll assume that the metaphors used by the hip hop community to describe sampling, to describe the sampling of Brazilian music, I'll assume that this expresses a reality about sampling, or at least lets us read the kind of potentialities that are projected onto sampling through often naive mannerisms. So Blumenberg developed metaphorology in the 60s to register linguistic senses right before they crystallized into meaning. In metaphor, he thought these senses would not yet be flattened by a superimposed architectonics of meaning. So the terminology used to discuss a subject in the preliminary stage of its formulation for him would often reveal more about how said subject is dealt with than any settled definition. And the concepts that can be defined with precision have already been socially circumscribed and have then been reduced from the broader networks of meanings that they initially drew upon when in the form of metaphors. So for Blumenberg, metaphors are leftovers from a different quasi-mythological apprehension of reality that would attempt to fulfill the first intuition of an object way before explicit semantics did so. So if properly studied, these metaphors could reveal elements of our imagination that are not well distinguished in stable linguistic concepts. So in the spontaneity, in the perplexity, and even in the imprecision of metaphorical language, one would be able to access ingrained assumptions that are not yet clear in general semantics, right? In the particular case of hip hop sampling, the metaphor of digging is not only abundant in my conversations and field experiences, but was established for decades by and in hip hop communities. It already functions as a theoretical fiction for producers to construct a sort of cognitive model and a sort of interpretive guideline for sampling, right? So the act of looking for records to sample has been homogeneously called crate digging for decades now, and that term has even been added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary as such. It refers, on one hand, to these once very material milk crates or cardboard boxes where old records used to be found in the 80s and 90s, as you can see in the pictures. Um, since other media like cassettes and CDs were substituting vinyl by then, DJs were able to find rare vintage records for cheap in garage sales or abandoned in basements of people who simply did not want them anymore, right? In those, the records would often be offered in crates, which perfectly fit the 12-inch dimensions of the LPs. DJs did not say they were crate buying or crate searching or even crate hunting, though. They were crate digging. So for them, there was an aspect of excavation in the very survey of the records, the survey for the records in their crates, right? Which means the term was actually not that material, given the records are not literally buried under each other, right? But they were a symbolic abstraction of the process of finding songs to sample. Sure, the metaphor indicates in part an archaeological sense in the selection of physical secondhand records, but they also say a lot more about the adventure of going to the store and finding one specifically valuable musical excerpt in the right place at the right time, among many other discarded or seemingly invaluable ones. First of all, digging for samples implies a sense of depth, right? Or the existence of vertical layers of value, including some that would cloak the source before it could be found. So the notion of this underlying region also applies to metaphors like the tip of the iceberg, which was used by Brian Cross in Conversation to describe his knowledge of Brazilian music before traveling there to dig on the ground, as I quote. That verticality is present too in a lot of the talking of the depth of a research project or the dust of old records, which would accumulate around it like concrete evidence of temporal passage as a form of sedimentation and erosion, right? In that case, digging implies a passing of time and the fossilization of unused records and archaic strata of history, like a forgotten past of some kind. Different metaphors for digging also imply a reversal of the normal order of valuation by the sampling producer once the musical source is found. So the obscure excerpts of Brazilian music to be unearthed or extracted, and those are all quotes, by a DJ, they usually inhabit an underworld. That's why to dig is also to, quote, flip the sample, right? When the rapper or producer flips the sample, the original musical source ascends from the subterranean vaults of history to the outside light of the present world, of contemporary sensibility, of mass media, of market capitalism. So Blumenberg himself dedicated many pages of his book to the metaphorical darkness, opaqueness, and indistinctness of the underground, which derived from the counterposing idea of light as truth and purity, right? That is in Plato, in Cicero, and a lot of the Catholic philosophy. And Bachelard also invested a chunk of his book on the imagination of the earth to the notion of introversion, or the invasion and unknotting of a reservoir of hardened significations. And in a way, what the hip hop producer does when flipping is to liberate music that would be otherwise doomed to a certain eternal incarceration, right? Being stuck or frozen on forgotten shelves in a record store, taken from there to a sort of afterlife of outside light in the ears of a new audience. The process of flipping a sample is also a kind of work. After all, literal digging is a manual labor that requires the muscular struggle of the hands and the consistent long-term use of tools like picks and shovels to award any fruits. In the same way, the metaphor of crate digging for records implies a technical gesture of the hand in the store, as producers quickly sort through dozens of crates with hundreds of records, as well as a measure of real work in the sense of a time-consuming, energy-consuming exercise about learning, about musicians, and labels and genres and cultures, right? So that's why in direct conversation, producers like Greg Cass and Joe Davis and David Buttle and Mario Caldato, all of them highlighted an essential element of tactility and of in-person, on-site record seeking in their conception of sampling. Um, it's as if there needs to be like the work of digging must be done through hours of listening and studying and buying and selling and actually sweating for the glory of the discovery, right? For the search to be a real digging, there must be the work of expedition into the concealed cave of music. It's no coincidence that hip hop producers and fans alike will call obscure and highly expensive Brazilian records gems or treasures. This is yet another archaeological image following the metaphor of digging, which awards a metalist or mineralist tonalities to a certain reverie of excess power in the excerpt to be sampled. More than simply a continuation of digging, this term reveals other implied meanings in the relation between the producers and their musical sources. Chuck D writes about the sources of sampling as minerals, for example, and Reza constantly mentions the jewelry of hip hop. And the imagination of the precompositional process of sampling as digging for gems seems to have even spread to the wider conversation of collectors in such a way that owners of record stores that are specialized in Brazilian music, like Palo Santo and Tropicalian Furs, will openly talk about their practice as an archaeology, properly speaking. The implication of the gem is that there are good and bad sources for sampling, and the good ones are rare, like diamonds in the bedding of a mine, right? So the gem is made up of a different material than the earth around it, which is indistinct, homogeneous, made up of formless components. So what the metaphor says first is this: most records are decomposable, dispensable, indifferent, but some, those that are suitable for sampling, have an inner value, a shiny, glowing quality that clearly distinguishes them from others in the process of digging, right? Um, there's a sort of vitalist implication of encountering vibrant matter amidst the trash here, and a certain fetishization of the agency that's distributed in that musical object, as if the sources of sampling had an everlasting aura that allowed them to overcome the superficiality of historical deposition. Second, this metaphor implies that once a gem is encountered by a producer, it cannot be re-encountered by a second one, because once the source is sampled, its worth is automatically cashed out. There's a sort of economic index then relating this imagination of a gem's worth to each record's kind of social liquidity and exchange value. So after beatmaker Vertofels mentioned to me that a record by Brazilian musician Andrea Daltro now costs around $1,000 on Discogs, I asked if this made it more interesting to him. And his answer: it makes it more desirable for sure. I definitely want a record because of that. But I don't think it affects the... No, it totally makes it more interesting, I would say. You read that and you're like, oh fuck, who is this mysterious guy? The gem of sampling is not defined solely through its scarcity, of course, but it is only valuable if it can be flipped. If there's a way of inserting into the experience of the found music some sort of interest which was not there in the moment of the dig. This kind of transvaluation, this revision of the evaluation of a gem's worth, can only be achieved when the musical excerpt is caught and by the producer and recontextualized, right? A large part of the appeal of crate digging is exactly in pulling this off, in launching something from a lower level of estimation to a higher one. The gem needs to have some popular appeal to be able to later acquire more value, but equally, it needs to be foreign and unknown when it is encountered in order to mobilize listeners towards it, right? To make it mysterious enough. So the hip hop producer becomes a kind of grand wizard or alchemist in the language of hip hop by projecting value into the record or transmuting gold from clay, right? As B Plus explained to me, part of the genius of Madlib is that he can make you want to hear. When you hear it the way he hears it, you want to have that record now, right? This transvaluation of the musical source is part of the extractivist implication of the metaphor of digging too, especially when the sample music comes from another culture, like Brazilian culture, right? Stephen Feld has famously theorized the world music phenomenon of the 80s as a form of new colonial domination and escalation of patterns of dependence between local and global music. And his arguments has found resonance in Novak's investigation of sampling and reissue cultures in the 2010s. Indeed, the metaphor of crate digging is complicit with problematic dimensions of the figures of the miner and the archaeologist, too. It often role plays the sort of salvage anthropology that was common in the beginning of the 20th century. For example, when in attempts to defend sampling, some interviewees claimed that hip hop was saving the Brazilian music it samples from extinction, right? And it often also involves a sort of Orientalist exoticization, such as when a record store owner like Joe Stones awards to the musical sources a supernatural quality, telling clients to, quote, immerse in the magic of the intergalactic voyage into unknown Brazilian music. At the most extreme bottom of the metaphor of digging, after all, is a sense of appropriation. Sampling itself has always been a type of appropriation, and it's kind of direct copy of a source, and it always had to deal with accusations of theft. As copyright got more severe and sampling more official, even within hip-hop circles, the factor of appropriation in the dig advanced beyond the frontier of American copyright law into countries where its severity had not yet reached. As many of my interviewees reported, it was a legal reason that made international samples very popular in the 2000s. It was simply easier to sample from Peruvian singer Ima Sumac like Black Eyed Peas did, or French prog rock band Cortex like MF Doom did, than to fight George Clinton in court and probably lose like NWA had done before them. Some of the more obscure international artists to be sampled then might not even hear of the sample ever, or they might not even know who was responsible for their own licensing rights. The crate digger is now metaphorically this international prize chaser, facing the roles of record stores like Indiana Jones faces the Well of Souls, as if their store formed whole ecologies, forests, wildernesses that the producer faints journeying into in their fictive imagination, for inside of them may lie Xanadu, Akako, or Z El Dorado. In this case, digging throws us back to a sort of imperial relation of subservience between colony and metropole, where one takes resources from the other and exports them for less than what they're worth, as it happened many times and still does in European archaeological museums, right? It's true that very often hip-hop producers and reissue labels will try to respect the cultures that they're serving and pay back their deeds as to avoid any possibility of exploitation. And that often sampled Brazilian musicians like Arthur Verocai would really never have a career if it wasn't for this rehabilitation of sampling. But in some cases, producers will still reinscribe that colonial mindset, like Brazilian DJ Nuts has commented very assertively regarding some reissue labels. I quote, they're still trying to colonize us. It's still on. They put out a bunch of bootlegs. They're still extracting the best of what we have, exploiting us. They look at our music as the new gold, the new lumber. They took everything before, they took the gold, they raped the woman, they stole, they killed, they taught religion. Now they're putting out our music over there. At the center of this metaphor of digging to describe sampling, there is this temporal relation with an archive of music. Just to conclude, of an archive of music from the past, a music from elsewhere, right? Digging is a way of dealing with the past or seeing how the past appears in the new music where it is used. The pre-compositional process of finding excerpts to sample is imagined as an archaeology following this kind of extraction of value from this past that's represented as a space of forgotten space of historical indifference. So the application of Blumenberg's metaphodologies to the discourses of hip-hop producers takes us to a sort of general designations of one of the central powers of sampling, which is its relationship with an other, especially the temporal other of the past, but equally so the geographical other of the foreigner. In sampling, there's a sort of refusal of the boundaries of a certain temporal and spatial context, and an attempt to reopen it and avoid the definite circumscription of history. As Bachelard shows, often the past is symbolically interpreted as the earth, precisely because it resists being opened like that. Nevertheless, hip-hop communities discuss sampling as if it did open the past and reconfigure it. So the metaphorical connotations of digging seem crucial to the poetics of sampling, as they make reference to a whole realm of implications and ways of conceiving of a producer's craft, especially when dealing with other music, like Brazilian music, whether hip-hop communities are explicitly reflecting about this or not. And metaphors used naively to describe music can quickly become genres in themselves, like soul or funk, to keep within the African-American canon. So they can assume the central importance in how we interpret and debate and even conceive of those sounds. So I hope I have helped to show how some metaphorical connotations in the discourse of hip hop communities can point to the way sampling is conceived in a larger life world of signification, especially when it refers to the Brazilian sample that I'm interested in. Thank you very much. Thank you. Believe that questions before the end. So now we're going to go about our research in hands on nurses of the Clacls Fellowship. She went to where she carried out research for dissertation work on nursing in the and perfect. First of all, everyone, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all so much. Thanks for the support and for giving us the opportunity to share our research. My research interests have typically been on specifically looking for their work in the archive. And Puerto Rico itself is an interesting subject because of its colonial status. As someone whose research focuses on gender and work, how did I end up on the transnational exchanges and diasporic experiences camp? The truth is I was asked, but it made sense and it made me rethink my approach, or rather my focus away from strictly gender. So I asked myself, how did transnationalism and diasporic influences affect Puerto Rican nursing, healthcare access, and public health policies between 1925 and 1960? And what do we mean when we use terms like transnational exchange, diasporic experiences, especially in the context of Puerto Rican? What are they within the framework of healthcare, and how does this relate to Puerto Rico's limits? Transnational exchanges refers to the flow of people, ideas, goods, cultural practices across national borders, and these exchanges often lead to the blending or adaptation of practices and knowledge, creating new or hybrid systems that can have wide-ranging impacts on different societies. Transnational exchanges are common in healthcare, education, economics, politics, where international collaboration and influence are. It can take the form of movement of people. In nursing, transnational exchanges might involve nurses traveling to other countries for training and bringing back that knowledge. It can be the flow of knowledge and ideas, facilitating the spread of information, best practices. Another type of transnational exchange is the transfer of technologies and resources, such as shared technologies, public health strategies, or educational tools. Cultural interactions are also a form of transnational. This is integrating cultural practices and adaptations to the. Finally, policy influence and development are also types of transnational exchange. Sometimes these exchanges affect policies and regulations as international organizations and governments collaborate on standards and influence. An example of transnational exchanges in my research is how US-based organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation funded the education of Puerto Rican nurses in North America, which in return with new knowledges and practices. These nurses blended American medical practices with local knowledge, creating a unique public health approach tailored to. While transnational exchanges can help address local challenges by narrowing the transfer, fostering international cooperation, it can also raise issues related to cultural imposition, where powerful countries' practices and standards overshadow or marginalize. In the colonial context at Puerto Rico, transnational exchanges were complex as they offered new resources and knowledge, but also reinforced American dominance in healthcare. Diasporic experiences stem from these transnational exchanges, especially specifically the movement of people. Diasporic experiences refers to the collective experience of people living outside their ancestral homeland.
community of people with shared cultural, ethnic, or national origins living across the. These experiences include challenges, adaptations, and unique perspectives that arise from maintaining connections to one's heritage while living in a new environment. While not always experienced by everyone, there are some central aspects to having a diasporic experience. One is identity and belonging. People in diasporic communities often balance multiple identities, joining aspects of their original culture, country, cultural retention, and adaptation. When living in diasporic communities, they often work to preserve their cultural traditions, values, while adapting to the practices of the country in which they operate. For instance, Puerto Rican nurses who study and work abroad might retain certain cultural practices while adopting new professional standards from the US or Canada. There's also a connection to the homeland. Many in the diaspora maintain strong ties to their homeland through family connections, visits, remittances, or advocacy. This connection influences how they view and support issues affecting, often leading to a sense of responsibility to development. Navigating discrimination and stereotypes. They may encounter discrimination, stereotypes, or prejudice. For example, Puerto Rican healthcare workers in the US may have faced biases or felt pressure to self to substance of their background. And even in Puerto Rico, sometimes nurses or American doctors were seen as in the workplace. Finally, influence on the homeland is another diasporic experience. Diasporic experiences often feed back into the homeland as individuals produce ideas and resources for their return or interact. For instance, Puerto Rican nurses trained abroad brought back new healthcare practices and influenced Puerto Rican healthcare system. For Puerto Rican nurses who traveled to the US or Canada in the early 20th century, diasporic experiences involved adapting to a new healthcare culture while training their nursing practices, often different from those back home. These nurses then brought this knowledge back to Puerto Rico, where they integrated it into local customs, significantly shaping public health on the island. Transnationalism enhances healthcare by enabling the exchange of innovative practices and resources, addressing global health disparities and fostering resilience that transcends borders. However, it also brings challenges such as cultural misalignment with practices, resource dependency, and potential inequities if certain regions or communities are prioritized. This is especially relevant in the case of Puerto Rico due to its Puerto Rico's limited status refers to its position as a fully integrated U.S. state, nor an entirely independent nation. Becoming a U.S. territory in 1898, Puerto Rico has a unique status that gives it some, not all, of the rights and privileges of the state. This ambiguity shapes many aspects of life on the island, political representation to economic policy, and carries significant implications for healthcare, education, and identity. Although Puerto Ricans are citizens, they lack voting rights in presidential elections and have limited Congress through a non-voting resident commissioner. This partial political integration affects Puerto Rico's autonomy and limits its ability to influence U.S. policies impacting the island. U.S. federal laws are also applied selectively to Puerto Rico, a complex legal environment. Puerto Rico receives less federal funding than U.S. states for essential healthcare, which can hinder infrastructure development and public health resources. Puerto Ricans often identify with both Puerto Rican and American identities, creating a dual sense of belonging. This cultural ambiguity shapes local perspectives on issues like education, language, and pride, often leading to tensions over autonomy and integration. Therefore, Puerto Rico's liberal status is significant in terms of health services. Limited federal funding impacts healthcare resources and public health, often leading to disparities in healthcare access and quality compared to states. Puerto Rico's reliance on U.S. federal support about full political autonomy creates a dependency that complicates efforts to achieve success. How it began. So I was doing research at the Rockefeller during COVID, Rockefeller Foundation, and the only thing available to me as researcher of Puerto Rico were Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship cards and a diary of a nursing supervisor from Rockefeller. As I began to think of the role of the Rockefeller Foundation in shaping public health policy in Puerto Rico, I also began to think about other external forces like the United States government, other philanthropic groups, and missionary groups, and not just public health, but women for entry professions like nursing. What the cards look like. How did these Puerto Rican nurses then adapt and integrate U.S.-based practices for local needs and their needs? Also, the period I'm covering, the 1920s to 1950s, is a formative period for women. Nursing offers a new role for women in Puerto Rico. Having done some extensive research in the States, I wanted to see what the Puerto Rican perspective is. The Center for Latin American and Caribbean and Latino Studies enabled me to spend almost a month in Puerto Rico. From there, I was able to visit the Colección Puertorriqueña de la Universidad de Puerto Rico en Piedras, la Sala de Colecciones Especiales de la Universidad de Ciencias Políticas, el Archivo General de San Juan. At these libraries and archives, I examined government documents, books, newspapers, and nursing bulletins, the last of which was published by the Nurses Asociación de Enfermeras Nacionales. The funding I received from Clacls provided resources to not only uncover the role of outside organizations and transnational health and their influence on local health practices in Puerto Rico, also provided the ability to Puerto Rico's own agencies and work on their own. As a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico has faced unique challenges in developing. Their health systems have been influenced by policies formulated on the U.S. mainland about how they lead. Puerto Rican public health professionals such as nurses have often had the technical ability, but also understand the socio-political factors that affect outcomes. My research focuses on Puerto Rican women who are nurses from the 90s, how they addressed health disparities, promoted equitable care, and advocated for policy change, while contending with nuanced complexity of Puerto Rico's colonial past and its ongoing struggle for. The United States formally gained control of Puerto Rico in 1898, and the early 20th century saw substantial enforcement of sciences, including healthcare. The Rockefeller Foundation and other U.S.-based philanthropic and missionary organizations played prominent roles in reform, often framing American practices as superior. The period was marked by initiatives introducing U.S. public health standards to Puerto Rico, impacting how nurses were trained and integrated into healthcare. They did face significant public health issues, including malaria, bloodborne, and tuberculosis. These diseases were often exacerbated by socioeconomic factors such as poor sanitation and water, highlighting the need for public health. Nurses assisted with disease prevention, patient care, and public education initiatives, often as part of colonial health campaigns. The Rockefeller Foundation was a huge factor in public health mission in Puerto Rico during this time. Founded by John D. Rockefeller in 1913, the foundation's mission was to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Starting in the 1920s, they targeted Puerto Rico as a site for public health improvements, offering training opportunities for nurses and doctors in North America. It aimed to modernize health practices from diseases like bloodborne malaria and health. The foundations funded clinics and health programs and guided the establishment of county health departments modeled after U.S. systems. They also taught Puerto Rican nurses U.S.-style public health education, focusing on disease prevention and community health. Catholic and Protestant missions competed as well in preparing women. They established training schools such as the Presbyterian School of Nursing, empowering local women and expanding healthcare reach. For Protestant missionaries, religious motivations often combined with Americanization efforts drove healthcare delivery to rural areas where U.S. training was established. So why this period? Early 20th century marked the beginning of Puerto Rico's healthcare system, emphasizing preventive care and public health as pillars of community welfare. It was also the beginning of the professionalization of nursing and the development of nursing education. Nursing education evolved significantly during this period. The curriculum initially focused on basic care and hygiene, on public health practices, sanitation, and epidemiology. By the 1930s, Puerto Rican nurses were trained in advanced areas of trauma, disease management, reflecting broader efforts to modernize the island's healthcare. Nurses began organizing amongst themselves. La Asociación de Enfermeras Puertorriqueñas, Puerto Rico Nurses Association, advocated for improved education standards, working conditions, and regulations of nurses and professionals. They played a crucial role in advancing the professionalism of nursing and provided a collective voice for Puerto Rican nurses. The introduction of nursing license in Puerto Rico was a critical milestone in nursing. Nursing licensure in Puerto Rico in 1930 with the signing of Ley 77 or Law 77. It established the Nurse Examiners Board, which set and enforced standards practices. Licensing ensured a standardized level of education and competence. La Asociación de Enfermeras Graduadas was another organization, and they set up a regulation They also advocated and promoted themselves, contacting the governor to establish Semana de la Enfermera versus celebrated in Puerto Rico, which is to this day. By the 1940s, nurses were fully integrated into hospitals and community health centers, where they played roles in patient care, health education, and disease prevention. Nurses funded by Rockefeller Foundation learned how to standardize public health procedures and health professionals. For example, the Home Enter Education campaign involving sanitation efforts, health education, and nurse training to improve public health led to increased health literacy and reduced community infection rates, foundation for public health integration in Puerto Rico. Missionaries also influenced public health and nursing. Catholic and Protestant missionaries established hospitals and clinics, especially in rural areas where health care was sparse. Nursing schools run by clinicians were crucial in training local healthcare workers and establishing Puerto Rican nursing as a profession. Integrating American Protestant and Catholic values with healthcare created nursing ethos that combine religious duty. I first encountered Celia Guzman on the fellowship part of Rockefeller Foundation. She was born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico in 1902. In 1935, she sailed to New York on the SS Como Student at the University of Toronto. She was one of the many Puerto Ricans who received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation to further literacy so that they could return to Puerto Rico. Ms. Guzman's instructors and supervisor considered her a successful trainee. An entry dated September 25 by one of the Rockefeller nursing supervisors. It commented, on interviewing Ms. G, I find her educationally so far superior to the other Puerto Ricans that she may be a candidate selected. Her leadership down there later on when American, at any rate, she is good. In Puerto Rico this summer, I learned that Ms. Guzman did secure a leadership position when she returned. She served as the director of the program of nursing at the Department of Preventive Medicine, Tropical Medicine, and retired after 20 years. Guzman was also an active member and president of the Association of Nurses and Graduate Nurses. She received the Medal of Association of Graduate Nurses in recognition of her work, a dedication in June 71 nursing bulletin. Puerto Rico su enfermera refers to her as a teacher, the historian of nursing, to communicate the values of nursing to the student and nurses today and tomorrow, encourages and inspires. In 1986, she was still honored posthumously. Celia Guzman passed down her nursing knowledge both as an educator and historian. Her story illustrates how diasporic experiences shaped Puerto Rican health care and our profession. Like Guzman, many fellows and nurses trained abroad returned to influential positions and leadership roles. Puerto Rican nurses formed associations and advocated for standard public recognition. They formed associations and created publications to advance the profession, educate the public, and recognition. This illustrates how diasporic experiences didn't only benefit individual communities, but fostered a strong professional identity. The nursing profession provided new respected roles for Puerto Rican women outside the domestic sphere, challenging traditional gender. An opinion piece in the Puerto Rican newspaper El Mundo by a prominent physician exalts the virtues of the public health nurse. Employment in nursing allowed women to participate in the workforce to make decisions on public health policy in America. Therefore, female nurses could serve as role models, advocating for public health education and influencing health practices among Puerto Rican families. Of course, nursing had both its challenges and opportunities. Nurses sometimes face biases from U.S. officials and government by colonial dynamics, U.S. awarded U.S. trained professionals. U.S. oversights also sometimes limited local input and adaptation. Lack of medical supplies and facilities required nurses to be resourceful, adaptive practices. But they were also offered opportunities in this period. A shortage of nurses allowed for advanced training for local nurses and advanced training. Fellowships for philanthropic education and career advancements. Namely, Puerto Rican nurses to lead public health. Puerto Rican nurses provided care in hospitals and rural areas, focusing on preventive care, health education, conducted vaccination drives and sanitary inspections, often working under challenging conditions. They crucial role in managing public health crises during outbreaks of some diseases like and malaria, and their training enabled them to vaccinations and education communities. thinking about the future. So my research over the summer, I thought about how my research contributes to post-colonial studies to understand the US colonial impact on the remaining colonies. Archival further exploration into the archives from more primary sources. Comparative studies with places like the Philippines and the sea. Oral histories, gathering more oral histories from nurses, surviving nurses and their families. So some of the challenges was limited access to specific archives and making connections and the need to contextualize time and culture, but also gaining an understanding of how external forces, local health, especially mandates.
Questions or comments? Others?
Everybody's following.
No one has any questions. I actually have a couple of I think Romulo can hear us.
I can. I think not very well, especially your microphone, but the rest I can more or less understand.
So basically, this that you said that caught my attention was how people see it. I thought that was something.
Marco, can you? Do you hear better? Can you hear us now?
It's better now, yes.
Okay. So yeah, I'll just repeat. I'll ask you a question and then Kathy another question. You said in a part of your presentation that hip hop saved Brazilian music. There was a mention, something along those lines. And it made me think about, the ethic of transmission of knowledge and of safeguarding. So do you have some reflection around how this transmission and safeguarding of cultures and music can be thought of as an ethics of care? Or perhaps if you haven't theorized too much of that, do you think that this makes some sense, or could you develop something around those lines?
Yeah.
The other question I had was for Kathy, that you can clearly see how Puerto Rico's liminal situation and colonial status influences the very top-down kind of training in terms of public health and specifically nursing. But you're also mentioning how some local initiatives actually also had the capacity of shaping how it ended up being, for instance, by women's organizing the Nurses Week, right? So I'm thinking about along these lines that there seems to be some type of cross-pollination going on, not only for the case of Puerto Rico, but I'm curious about, do you think that there are influences that the Puerto Rican experience or through the Puerto Rican experience may have influenced, the Rockefeller Center in the way that they thought of public health, or even, American doctors visiting, coming back and bringing something back to, the colonial center?
Well, so the School of Tropical Medicine was the first school, the School of Tropical Medicine was created actually to train doctors in tropical medicine. And then go back to Latin American countries, because it was at the time that America was exploring. It's like 1920s, so they're exploring the different areas of Latin America, and so it becomes a place for them to train in tropical medicine, which did not exist in North America at that point. So definitely it's seen as that, but it's kind of like US imposed school, because it's with Columbia University. The School of Tropical Medicine is in partnership with Columbia University. So it's through Columbia University, the School of Tropical Medicine in Puerto Rico. And a lot of the doctors, even the Puerto Rican doctors, are US trained. And there's in one of the diaries, one of the nurses comments that she's like, the best doctors are the US trained doctors. when she's talking about the Puerto Rican doctors. So there's definitely like a mentality that the U.S. is the modern, is the good. And so part of what I'm arguing is also this Americanization that's going on at that same time in Puerto Rico, because that's the time of Americanization. It's like the 1910s to like the 1930s, and there's also pushback in education, and I'm trying to see if there's pushback in healthcare, and it might be different because of the things that are going on, because there's definitely is a problem in healthcare. There is, you have disease, you have at that point low infant mortality rate or high infant mortality rates, low high mortality, like, there's high mortality rates, there's high infant mortality rates. So there are definitely problems, and you have high hookworm is a problem, malaria is a problem. So there's definitely problems, but how do you navigate this feeling of being imposed, these America is correct, while also trying to help your people, I guess, like, and so how do you balance that? Like, you want your Puerto Rican people to get better, to get modern healthcare, but you don't want it to be imposed on you in that way. Like, you want to have a say. And some of the things that I'm looking at is like the nurses create like these magazines where they sort of are meant for them. There are these bulletins, these journals, and they talk about how like little snippets of like, how do you create the perfect tray for a patient, like food tray for a patient, which is kind of like, you think about it, like this is like 1936 or something, and you don't even think about that now, but like this is like, what should be on this tray, what kind of food, but like this idea of how they're decimating this information, spreading this information amongst themselves. Yeah. But I don't know if there's a kind of, like, I am trying to think about that, like, what are they giving back?
Mm-hmm.
Or are Americans picking, are US trained, are US nurses and doctors picking up on what Puerto Rican nurses and doctors are doing and bringing that back? And that's, I actually am trying to see if I can see any of that, because I do think that would be interesting. And I don't see why that wouldn't be the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Romulo, can you hear us?
Yeah. Good question. Thank you. Yeah, so this theme of saving the music from extinction is very common. It appeared many times in the interviews. And in some cases it's justified, like Arthur Verocai, for example, is one artist that had given up of a career 30 years ago, and then now he's very, very big. There was a concert of his in New York celebrating the history of hip hop, actually, a concert of a Brazilian musician. And it was very, very full, and like, and he became part of this narrative of a certain narrative, certain history of Brazilian music that Americans will do. For example, my students, for example, they think he's very big in Brazil, or so the history of Brazilian music for them is like samba, bossa nova, Arthur Verocai. But like, no one knows Arthur Verocai in Brazil. My parents don't know him. No one really, he's not really famous anywhere outside of the US or the hip hop context. So for that case, they really did save his career in a way. But there's also a lot of, there's this kind of what I call like a salvage, like I recall like James Clifford's salvage paradigm, in the way that early anthropologists would think they were kind of freezing some cultures before they would go extinct or something like that, as if cultures were some kind of static, fixed form that would have no dynamics to them. Like, of course, yes, like there's a sort of global market capitalism that disintegrates local indigenous cultures and stuff. That's for sure. But also cultures also develop, and there's a sort of kind of paternalistic view of Brazilian music in that, also implied, of like, oh, we are responsible for safeguarding your music. Right? A lot of them say like, oh, Brazilian people don't know their own music, which is like, I'm pretty sure there's more music that Brazilian people know about Brazil that you don't know. Like, if as if a Brazilian person would get to the US and know some sort of obscure musician and say, well, Americans don't know their own music. Well, there's probably more music here that also you don't know, right? So there is this kind of paternalistic view, this condescending view of like, oh, I am safeguarding this for you, right? But it's ambiguous because it is coming from a place of care. It is coming from a place of love, of like, well, we really love this music. We want to present this music to more people. Some of it is very unknown, even to Brazilians themselves, like Arthur Verocai. And if you talk to the musicians themselves, the Brazilian musicians, some of them are like, I love it. Like, I love being the jam. I love being like, I have this not like new niche audience of young people that are into like more alternative stuff or hip hop that in Brazil I didn't have. Brazil, my audience is old and waning. So it is very ambiguous in that sense. There's a sort of implication that's kind of weird in saying that. At the same time, it is an important practice, and a lot of hip hop producers will say they are doing archival work. Really, they're doing a sort of curation of the past for archival purposes, right? Like that's one of their main intentions. So I think the ambiguity of it is one of the things that interests me.
For a favor, just if we can write in the chat a few of the Brazilian gems that we found, because I'm super curious.
You hear that, Romulo?
Yeah,
If you could send on the chat some
yeah.
of the Brazilian gems.
Yeah, it's a lot of people like Marcos Valle, Arthur Verocai, and I interviewed a lot of them. It's a very interesting kind of so the curation.
Yeah, the ones the Brazilians would not know. The one, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think Verocai is one of them, but also like Carlos da Fé and Antonio Jocafi. So there are some musicians that are very particular to this hip hop producers milieu, um, that are not, or Joyce is kind of can be famous in Brazil but not really. So they kind of created this whole like alternative history of what Brazilian music is that is not what the history that we have is like. It's as if there was this undercurrent of some kind of good Brazilian music that no one knows, right? um,
So the public is very critical, and you are summoned to the office to continue this conversation with a specific list of names.
yeah.
Well, well, thank you so much for your presence. Thank you so much, both of you, for presenting. They are really interesting pieces of research, and we expect to hear more from both of you in the short future ahead of us. So I think that we are going to have yeah a recess for lunch, and we get back at what time? At 2. I know.